Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Artificially Inflated Traffic, a $2.4 billion problem, presented by Enea. My name is Joan Wiseman, and I'll be opening and closing this webinar. A few notes before we begin. We have a fantastic panel of speakers, and you can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. To access additional resources for today's presentation, please click the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen, and you can download them from there. If you'd like closed captions, you can access those from the bottom right corner of your video player. This webinar is being recorded, and so you will be able to watch it on demand within 24 hours after we conclude here today. We would love to hear from you. During the presentation, if you have a question at any point, please submit it using the Question and Answers tab, the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. And time permitting, the speakers will cover as many questions as they can and conclude with a Q&A session. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Simeon Coney is the VP of Business Development at Enea. Let's begin. Simeon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joan. So yes, really pleased today to be able to talk to you about artificially inflated traffic, or AIT. I am responsible for business development at Enea. We provide telecom and cybersecurity solutions to mobile operators, aggregators, CPaaS, and a range of other solutions like Internet of Things, enterprises, and fixed subscribers. So today we're protecting 4.5 billion people around the world with our solutions. And today I'm joined by Nick Lane, the Chief Messaging Officer of Mobile Squared, and Uku Tomikas, the CEO of Mesente Communications. I'd like you to introduce yourselves, please. Nick, starting with yourself.
Thanks, Simeon. So, as Simeon said, I'm Nick Lane. I'm the Chief Messaging Officer and Messageologist at Mobile Squared. We're the world's leading messaging intelligence provider, specialising in SMS, RCS, WhatsApp, and we've also been very active covering the AIT space.
Thanks, Nick. Uku?
Yes, my name is Uku Tomikas. I'm the CEO of Mesente. We're a global messaging provider focusing on enterprises, mid-market companies, especially working with a lot of financial service companies, logistics companies around the world, helping them have a secure messaging service at scale wherever it's necessary.
Thanks very much. So let's start with looking at what is AIT. Simple three-letter acronym. What we're finding is actually the definition of this is actually quite complex. Taking three industry bodies, the GSM Association, the i3 Forum, and also the Mobile Ecosystem Forum, each of these organizations has defined AIT. I put the detailed text here on the slide. Feel free to look at those in the handouts or the downloads available later. But the key thing about these definitions is that they are actually a variety of different descriptions covering different areas. So Nick, if I can actually start by asking you, as an industry analyst, you're really there keeping your finger on the pulse of industry trends, identifying issues. How would you characterize the level of concern about AIT that it's experienced by CPaaS aggregators and mobile operators whom you talk to?
It's quite big. It's a concern, certainly for a lot of the kind of the hyperscalers, the big major brands that use SMS only for international traffic, and in particular one-time passwords. This is they're looking to obviously connect and utilize the effectiveness of SMS when they're communicating with their customers. No other channel is as effective as SMS. So, once we found this kind of almost perfect use case for SMS, it appears to be kind of abused I'm sure we'll come on to that into greater depth as we come on. But no, there's massive concern because ultimately brands, for example, don't know what their budget is because of the changing market dynamics almost on a month by month basis. And that, they can't plan. We've heard of certain major brands running out of budget within 4 or 5 months of the year because of the kind of conditions that these things are operating. And part of that, and obviously the result of where we are as an industry, is AIT, and it's having a big impact.
Thank you, Nick. And Anuku, really being a CPaaS, you are talking daily with the brands, with the folks responsible for generating messages. Where are they of the issue of AIT? Is it something that you're hearing commonly from them?
It's interesting because there is no sort of common terminology behind what happens. Sometimes it's spoofing, sometimes it's artificially inflated traffic, sometimes it's boosting, sometimes there's another word used for it, but quite often what we hear is the exact same thing that Nick said, which is out of control budgets and people feeling that something is wrong with the channel, that it just doesn't function as it should or as it did previously. And there's a bit of trepidation to open up a new market, for example, especially if we also pre-warn that particular market has a high probability of getting attacked. So it's definitely a limiting factor on usage, but also a very limiting factor in terms of what people want to use it for, what brands want to use it for, where they want to sort of lead their spend towards.
Oh, thanks. And in fact, actually, we've just got a question in fact, very pertinent. So the question is, why did it take Elon Musk commenting on AIT for it to garner such interest in the industry? I mean, I confess I hadn't really heard the term AIT in use up until about 2 years ago. And I think, the numbers that Twitter shared were that they were being scammed to $60 million a year on SMS texts. I mean, certainly from my perspective, sometimes it takes public statements from industry figures to actually put things into the sort of the public realm of discussion. As you mentioned, Yuku, sometimes it needs a phrase of focus to get people to talk about it. I mean, Nick, what's your view on that? Did it take Elon to make this a common talked about subject, or do you feel that people have been talking about this beforehand?
People have been talking about this beforehand, and to be honest, even from our research, from when we've been talking to industry for about the last 6 years or so, we've always included AIT as a fraudulent component, but it's always been overshadowed. It's always been kind of the least impactful of all frauds. The focus has always been on grey routes, it's always been on spam, it's always been on phishing and so on and so forth. AIT is, it's kind of very much a peripheral fraud, but yeah, I think Musk did kind of bring it to the limelight. It's already a big concern among the messaging ecosystem, all the messaging events. It was becoming a subject that a number of companies were presenting on. They were this is kind of identifying the models that they were witnessing on their network via their nodes and so on and so forth. So it was around, people were aware of it, but I think Musk put a figure on it and he blamed the operators. And I think that's where all of a sudden people stood up and took a bit more notice. But I don't think it had the impact that we think maybe it should have had, in the sense that if you look at, if it was, say, Zuckerberg who came out and said it, and it was Facebook, given the amount of Facebook traffic, then I think there would have been widespread panic throughout the whole of the messaging ecosystem. I think because Musk said it, it's kind of there's been a relatively calm response that something has to be done now. And I think the fact that the brands are aware of this fraudulent activity and more brands are becoming more and more aware of it, as an industry, we've got to act now. And I think the issue is previously with grey routes, that was always kind of a kind of symptomatic of the industry itself, and the fraud was against the operators. Now the fraud is directly against the brands, and actually they're the ones that are basically kind of feeding this ecosystem. So if we don't keep them happy and we lose them, the ecosystem shrinks.
Thanks, Nick. And you mentioned that one of the things that Elon did was put a figure on it. So in fact, moving on to our next slide, in fact, this is sharing research that Mobile Squared have done on actually looking at the volume of AIT traffic over the past 3 years. On the left-hand side, we have a projection of how many messages were sent over the last 3 years, from 2021 to 2023. And on the right-hand side, a projection of really the enterprise spend, turning those traffic numbers into actually financial costs. So, Nick, can you give us some context on that growth? Because, I mean, certainly these numbers are looking like quite an aggressive growth rate here.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's basically created kind of a perfect storm for AIT over the last 2 years. So we've seen the increase of the international termination rate in about a lot of markets, basically, and we can come on to the figures a bit later on. But that in itself has kind of fueled the interest from the rogue element within the industry, and and beyond the industry as well. It has to be said, because obviously it's much easier for them to generate more revenue if a message is worth 25 cents per message, as opposed to what we used to see of about 3 cents per message. So over the last 2 years, the average cost to the international termination rate has gone up from, I think, $0.033 to about this time last year, it was 0.0645. And now, based on the latest pricing data we've received in the last few weeks, it's gone up even further to 0.07076. So, the prices are still going up. So it's still an issue. And so it's where there are high rates, you're still going to get a lot of rogue activity to kind of capitalize on that information. On that, there are other components that are kind of driving it in terms of exclusivity agreements between an aggregator and an operator. And in certain cases, these have been abused for a number of reasons. And again, I think we'll come on to that a bit later on. But in terms of why the spend suddenly gone up, it's because this is an opportunity, kind of the rogue element within the ecosystem. If they find a loophole, if they find any opportunity to kind of exploit the marketplace, that's what they'll do. And that's kind of what we're experiencing. So just looking at it from the traffic perspective, in terms of the 2023 figure, I think we actually put in the white paper, that figure could probably be anywhere between 20 and actually 40 billion. It's because of the nature of kind of the traffic that we're trying to kind of quantify and qualify, that it could be anything. It's kind of phantom traffic. But what we have done is look at the impact on brands that we're talking to and the industry, and that's really where we kind of created this revenue figure, the impact of hitting and impacting brands of 1.2 billion last year.
Thanks, Nick. And as you say, it may be phantom traffic, but it's real money. This is money coming from somewhere, really from the brands. So I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
This is again showing a shocking growth on the cost of that. Are you seeing that affect customer confidence in messaging as a viable channel for A2P? Sorry, that's to Yuku there. Are you seeing this when you're talking with customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I see it in two very sort of distinct areas where I see this kind of transitioning over to brands or it impacting their decisions. It's one, what is the actual use case and how much they will apply it? But from another perspective also, how much they're willing to risk it, how much they're looking at alternatives. So, there are businesses that were perfectly happy using SMS all the time because of its usability, because of how good it is. And then now exploring and switching over to channels or options that I would consider inferior, such as flash calling, for example, just so they could drive the costs back down and keep scaling, keep the transactions flowing and doing things like that. So we're seeing a lot of impact coming, especially from the usage, their bank accounts, what they're willing to do. But also, I probably have never had so many negotiations from a legal perspective as a business, from how much we're allowed to raise the price, what's the sort of the liability for one business, another business. So it even has legal ramifications on like contract renewals and what people are willing to use those renewals for and how they're willing to approach those, which is another interesting facet of this AIT phenomenon and how it's impacting brands themselves as well.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, when we start to look at this then from the perspective of the brands, I mean, this is presenting numbers that we've measured, again, real numbers in terms of the effect of AIT on just one brand in one market. The green bars on this particular chart are what we measure as being their typical daily legitimate traffic, and the turquoise bars being the level of AIT. And you can see that it's a very significant increase. In fact, when we look at this and extrapolate it across the year, we can see that a typical budget would be, in this instance, about 400K. But in fact, due to AIT moving that number up to about $1 billion total spend as a result of that AIT. So, Yuko, again, I think you sort of touched upon it there just in your last answer bit. Are you seeing this reflected in your discussion with customers? I mean, are there examples that you can share where you've seen their costs increase dramatically due to AIT?
Absolutely. We've seen businesses in certain markets. And again, like AIT is interesting because it's also consistently evolving in the nature of it being applied. So certain businesses will, especially in their key markets, get attacked consistently, but also in a, what would be in air quotes, reasonable manner. So they would get boosted, their average traffic would go up by, let's say, 20%, 30%. So it wouldn't be like a 30x increase of their traffic, right? So it's constantly blended in, constantly hidden within the traffic. So it's much harder to sustain. But then when you look, let's say 2023 numbers and compare them to 2022 numbers, and then compare it to user growth, and then compare that to the actual revenue achieved from those users, then you start seeing the large shifts in the actual data and how it's playing around, where businesses say they think 40% of, let's say, a food delivery companies, certain markets, user base that they're seeing for 2023 or user base growth that they're seeing for 2023 is fraudulent. Because the rate, the transactions that should come afterwards, the purchases, the meal orders, etc., are just not following after that. But it's not only that, it's also where it's being used. One is just creating, fake accounts, doing fake transactions, and that not churning into revenue. But it's also, for them, interestingly enough, use cases where they get fake couriers. So they think that their peak time is covered in terms of how much logistical capabilities they have for, I don't know, a regional event, for example, that's coming up, or some holiday that they expect a boost in orders. And then it turns out that they don't have as many riders as they thought that they had. So they're going to have to start boosting the amount of money to pay to existing riders, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this consistent development of that. And then there are certain businesses on the other side where their average spend per month on SMS, for example, is 300 euros, and they get attacked with a big blast of messages into markets that they decided to keep open, and it's 6,000 euros, 7,000 euros, which might be their entire SMS allocation for the next 2 years, for example. So there's also this sort of differentiation between what it does and how it impacts different brands and how it impacts businesses of different size. Smaller companies tend to get hit with big attacks. Big companies, at least in our portfolio, are now starting to get gradual, consistent attacks, like somebody's trying to protect their margin in this game, rather than trying to make, a quick bang or a quick buck at a very large speed.
I see. That's a very good point as well you raise there about sort of the two factors. I mean, certainly from an industry perspective, it's very easy to get parochial and measure the costs as far as our industry goes. But you're absolutely right. There's a consequential cost to the brands as a result of this, and how it affects their planning for their business. So, I mean, really the question is, can the industry come back from this? If they are experiencing this increase in cost without that corresponding growth in business? Will brands actually be able to trust SMS again? I mean, Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yes and no. I mean, some of the research that we've done, some of the brands will forgive the channel because they need to. I mean, ultimately, who we speak to, everyone agrees that SMS is the best channel, and it's also the best channel because of its effectiveness in terms of reach and for delivering mission critical content. So, with things like one-time passwords, there's nothing really better. I mean, for it, because we did our own experience. We were setting up our an account online, and the first stage of the authentication process was emailed, and that email didn't arrive for about 20 minutes. And by the time that email arrived, the session had timed out, and we had to repeat the process. The next stage of the process, once we did actually click through using the password on email, we used SMS, and the SMS arrived within a second. So again, it kind of shows why there is this demand, and why brands are kind of being persisting with it, and some are obviously being forced to pay some very high charges. So there are brands that have lost trust in the channel, and they are expediting their means and exploration onto other channels and usage of other channels. Other brands will be looking to use other channels in conjunction with SMS. But overall, I think what's happened over the last 2 years or so, there will be a long-term impact on this, and I think the worst is yet to come. But I think the market will recover, but it will recover to a lower level of traffic than what we're seeing prior to 2022, unless, of course, different traffic types re-emerge certainly on the international scene. So, for example, 90% or so of all traffic now is one-time passwords. So that's pretty much cannibalized lots of other, like the marketing. It's not to say marketing might come back. So if marketing comes back, that could re-energize this part of the market.
Thanks, Nick. I see we've got a question coming in saying that other than AIT generated on international traffic, do we also see AIT being generated on local messaging traffic? And certainly I can share that from Enea's perspective, where we are deploying AIT inspection and control and mitigation solutions, yes, we absolutely see AIT affecting local brands, local traffic. I mean, effectively, the set of techniques work to any brand. Yes, international has certain cost factors, but it's not just cost, and it also depends on the market. Local traffic can be just as lucrative to the sources of AIT. So yes, we find it on a range of traffic types for a range of business, including local. So looking at the definitions, I mean, we saw earlier that we've got three industry groups, the MEF, the GSMA, and the i3 Forum, who've defined AIT. But sort of taking it down a level, what exactly does this mean for each player in the ecosystem? So we've put up this map starting with the source of messages on the left-hand side, the brands, moving through the campaign service providers, the CPaaS, transiting through the inter-exchange carriers, the aggregators who are carrying the traffic cross borders, through to connecting aggregators and direct connect aggregators, to the MNOs, and ultimately to the end users. And what we can see is when we map the definition of each of those industry groups onto this ecosystem, really the one that most of the definitions seem to focus on is something that we characterize as bot amplification generation of AIT. And what we really mean there is that there are bots using accounts on the services of these brands that are generating messages through this entire ecosystem. But looking at the definitions, there are a couple of additional scenarios depending upon which organization. So, for example, the MEF touch upon something that we've characterized as counterfeit fabrication. Not significantly built out, but this is really the generation of messages from within the inter-exchange carrier and the aggregator perspective rather than at the brand point of origin. The i3 Forum also make reference to P2P AIT. And again, this is something that we're seeing anecdotally ourselves, is it's not just A2P traffic on international and domestic brands, but it can also be consumer traffic, and techniques that we've seen happen in voice over the past years. And then lastly, the GSMA have made reference to end user created AIT. And this is an interesting one where malware or abusive applications are deployed on handsets that actually generate traffic back through the bands that pass back down through the ecosystem. And again, a range of different techniques there, from deliberate malware through to service resell apps and a range of other emerging techniques on that. So as you can see, a range of different definitions affecting a range of different types, and a certain level of, let's say, confusion and possibly even contradiction. So Nick, a question for you. Do you feel this sort of lack of consistency in definition and the presence of ambiguity actually possibly even serves and benefits the sources behind AIT? Oh, sorry, Nick, I think sorry, go ahead, Nick. Yeah.
There you go. It wouldn't be a webinar unless someone left the mute on. I think I think looking at the very nature of AIT itself, I think, does it fuel the ambiguity and everything? I don't know, because it's almost like the ultimate philosophical question, isn't it? If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around, does it make a noise? It's the same kind of thing pretty much with the majority of AIT, in that if a message is sent but not delivered, did that message ever exist? Well, actually, if you look at kind of the billing mechanism, yes, it did exist. But if you look at the consumer's phone, no, it didn't exist. So, that's kind of what we're up against here when we're trying to understand exactly what AIT is. So the ambiguity, I think, doesn't really help in terms of the various definitions, because I think it's still quite early days in trying to understand exactly what it is. And I think, obviously, when we come on to your taxonomy, it starts to help kind of explain the different kind of techniques that are being used. But I think ultimately AIT it's the brands have to understand what AIT is, because I guess if they don't understand what it is, they won't know what the industry is doing to tackle it, and therefore it's either going to be a kind of long-term problem or something that's going to be tackled, and they will then have got more faith and confidence back in the channel again. So I think from an industry perspective, we probably do need to nail something and agree on what it is, because then we can all move forward in kind of addressing that actual problem.
Thanks, Nick. So in fact, to your point there, yes, one of the initiatives that Enea has kicked off is a taxonomy on AIT types. From our own measurements, we could see that there were additional AIT traffic behaviors that were not captured in those three definitions from the GSMA, the i3 Forum, and the MEF. So specifically highlighting them, I've added them here onto the slide, and taking the first of these, something that we call a masquerade parasite. And this is something that is present and visible at the CSP point. And what we mean by this is it's an account that is now representing and presenting traffic from other brands that it is not responsible for. So it might be an account A that has been sending campaigns related to a particular set of products and services that it has responsibility for. But then with AIT, we see that account A starting to present traffic belonging to brands B, C, D, and E, creating this additional volume, which can then start to generate confusion in the infrastructure. When we start to compound this with additional techniques occurring in the inter-exchange side and aggregator side, with counterfeit fabrication, again using those same sending identities and starting to inject traffic into these connections, looking like it's appearing from sources, you can see that this volume starts to increase. Then additional capabilities that we're seeing on AIT, it spans a range of other types and definitions. A couple I just really wanted to highlight here. In the bottom left, there's something that we have termed artificial generation of traffic. Now, this is actually a term that is in common usage today. But when I mentioned ambiguity earlier, this is a great example, because in some definitions, AGT, artificially generated traffic, is the same or synonymous to AIT. Whereas what we're finding is that typically this has in the past and should continue to refer to the practice of generating test traffic legitimately. So brands, CSPs, aggregators, and MNOs can actually see parser traffic, service quality, delivery rates, things like that. So there is a place and a value for doing AGT that is not AIT. So again, one of the examples of how a definition of all of these things really does start to help bring clarity on that. You can see also, not just in terms of the different types of AIT, but there are additional behaviors of traffic that we see that, whilst are not AIT, actually drive and support the generation of it. And one of these is traffic trashing, where messages generated at one point in the flow may be dropped before they're then delivered either onto the terminating MNO or onto the end user. And in fact, I see there's a question here saying how much of the AIT traffic of 20 billion was actually terminated on the MNO network. So this, yes, is the process of traffic trashing. Now, it's actually quite hard to measure traffic trashing, because to do that, you really have to look at 2 points. You have to look at the source and the destination and confirm, did that message actually get through? And when it was generated at first point of measurement, was it a legitimate message or an artificial one? So very hard to quantify exactly how big the trashing part is of that. But we're certainly seeing some studies coming out from some sources that are putting that at certainly a couple of $1 million problem per network size. So yes, it is quite a sizable amount. But that doesn't negate the fact that this is real fraudulent cost to the brand. So whilst the traffic may not terminate on the MNO, it is having an effect on the ecosystem, and it is causing fraud at source. So I mentioned the definitions there. Again, if anybody wants copies of the slides, we'll make these available afterwards. We've got a description, and we're also generating a white paper that contains a lot more information about these definitions. So moving on then to the factors driving and masking AIT. I mean, Nick, on an earlier slide, we were talking there about the connectivity exclusive abuses and the international termination price increases. Can you expand a little bit more about those?
Oh, now we
Nick, you're on.
Oh, sorry. I'm in a noisy office. So we track 200 markets, and within those markets, we track 650 mobile operators. So, that just kind of puts a caveat in terms of what I'm about to say. So, of those, we believe about 1/3 of mobile operators have entered into exclusivity agreements with their chosen selected aggregated partner, and of those, that aggregator, with working with the operator, can then determine kind of what the price is. So there's been we believe, an abuse of some of these relationships, whereby the price has been set way too high for the cost to deliver the message, and so that's one of the knock-on effects in terms of why this is also one of the additional one of the three driving factors. So aside from the exclusivity agreements, you've then got the high prices. So looking at our latest data, there are roughly 2/3 of mobile operators who have their international termination rate above the old average rate from 2021 of $3. So, you then look at it, in actual fact, when we do our research, we believe that there is a ceiling in terms of what is acceptable from a cost perspective, and that is 10 cents. And if you look at the breakout in terms of those operators that we track, then 177 of them are priced above 10 cents, and a lot of them significantly so. So, that's also fueling this. And as I mentioned, it's also the rise of the one-time password. It's exploiting that use case. From a mobile messaging perspective, the one-time it's the golden goose. And obviously, we all know what happens to the golden goose. It doesn't last very long. And that's kind of that's almost where we're at now. We're kind of at a point where we will completely kill the goose, or somehow it will kind of recover. We put a band-aid on it and it moves on. It flies again into the sunset. That's obviously what as an industry we'd like to see happen. But, at the moment we're at one of, very much at a kind of tipping point in terms of what we'll see over the next 6 months. So I think, the three driving factors are the abuse of these exclusivity agreements, the high rates, and the pressure that's now on the one-time password.
Thanks, Nick. So those are the factors driving AIT, and as we mentioned, there's also factors that mask the full impact of this. We saw traffic trashing on the previous slide there. There's also virtual number out payment as well that can compound and drive additional usage of AIT. So, Yuku, are you seeing examples of these masking factors in active use? I mean, what's your experience talking with brands and operators?
Sure. I mean, trashing is something that pops up, especially when you're trying to understand the cases of AIT, or you're looking to test whether it's an AIT situation or not. So you try to test it. So you try to ask support for this number, or say this number didn't get messages, and then you actually don't get the necessary sort of information back for it. So you find a lot of these cases where you kind of know what it is, but then sometimes you're being sold a different idea. And I think one of the masking factors as well, or sort of maybe it's a driving factor, maybe it's a masking factor, is there's this level of willful ignorance, or maybe it's maliciousness, but I hope it's at least willful ignorance and not complete maliciousness, where I had this occasion last year with one of the biggest operators in our home market, where they told us quite openly as well that there was a request that came in to buy 100,000 numbers per month from their virtual numbers, right? Bear in mind, Estonia is a country of 1.3 million people, so 100,000 numbers per month. Take a few months, you have half of the population covered with those numbers. And the fact that the manager who we actually talked to about this particular topic said that, my legal team said that this smelled fishy. So the question I had was that you took this up to the legal team without ever wondering about the fact of, why would somebody ask me for something that is absolutely in no way, shape, or form realistic within the market? Or ask for more impact, or ask for why? Just the basic question of, why do you need 100,000 numbers a month in a market that is literally this small? Having that sort of lack of interest in why, who, what, where, when, just asking questions, understanding that is a huge masking factor behind it as well, because then you're enabling this as a business form to continue, enabling this to consistently be a part of this conversation like it's normal, like it's fine for somebody to, out of nowhere, for no reason, for no explanation, buy an immense amount of numbers in a market context. But of course, if you're buying those numbers, somebody's also making money off of those numbers. So that's where the question of, was this willful ignorance, or was this, in part malicious act to just make a little bit of extra money on somebody's part?
Thanks. So it really sounds like there's some quite important lessons that could be taken there and perhaps shared across the industry. I mean, this sort of awareness that what sounds like a great sales opportunity for one department is actually an enabler for some abuse to another department there. So, I mean, really looking at what can be done to address AIT. I think firstly, definition is absolutely the starting point. It's very hard to talk and solve a problem without a very clear definition of exactly what that problem is. And once a problem's defined, it can then be measured. Nick, we've got some great numbers here from yourselves talking about the level of traffic, the effect on price, being able to then get numbers coming bottom up from each source reported in a consistent fashion that matches those definitions. I'm sure you would find a very valuable data set to be able to then extrapolate the impacts. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's a case of getting traffic from source, so understanding kind of how much a brand has sent, how much a mobile operator has delivered, then you can then really work out what the difference is. So it's more a case, I think, of greater transparency in the industry. Companies that genuinely want to kind of tackle this threat, this fraudulent traffic, working together, kind of in unison to make sure that there is a greater understanding of kind of what goes in does come out. And from our side, yeah, of course, it'd be make our lives a lot easier.
And you could, you're sitting there in the traffic path and in the money path. So I'm sure you've been deploying solutions, helping your customers and also giving them guidance and advice. I mean, can you share some of the things that you've been doing to address customers' AIT issues?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we always start with is actually talking to the customers and understanding their use case more in depth and trying to actually map where is this product essential and where it isn't. Quite often businesses will want to open the entire world because what if my one user is roaming in Kazakhstan, even though 99.99999% of my users are in the UK? Like, do you specifically need that market open? Or shall we limit the amount of traffic that is allowed to that market? So you start putting in measures where you either block the market because it's actually not necessary, or you put in traffic control measures like not above this amount of messages per month, day, whatever, to actually start capping and understanding their actual business practices, being in constant communication to then also use machine learning to make sure those flows are as even as well as possible over time. But then also advising them on what endpoints should be protected how. If you have a sort of an endpoint that is dedicated to couriers, for example, who are more interested in working for you rather than you are interested in having them as customers, then you can introduce additional points of friction. You can perhaps add an extra layer of reCAPTCHA that's puzzle based and that's more difficult to solve, or you can add additional authentication layers to make it more intricate and maybe less susceptible to AIT. I mean, nothing's unfortunately bulletproof these days, but you can start understanding where you can allow for more friction in the process to protect yourself versus where you're going to be able to willfully take in a hit on AIT. And we have businesses like that as well, where conversion is so much more important than their damage of AIT. And ultimately, their pain threshold just hasn't been breached enough for them to go, no, we need to solve this, right? I had a business actually come up to me and say that unless my bills are about 200K per month, I don't care. And they were probably getting boosted at that point in time between 20 to 40,000 euros per month. But unless it reaches a certain threshold, for them conversion was king. But there are very few businesses for whom it functions like that. So we're constantly trying to work with them to understand their use cases, see where we can mitigate, where we can advise, where we can use our own traffic control measures, where business intelligence and numbers intelligence helps, et cetera, et cetera. So I would love to say that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, but with AIT, in most cases, we've seen there isn't. So it's a lot about understanding your user's business, working with them to find the best combination of mitigating the damage for them as much as possible.
Thanks. So, and on that basis, looking forward, 2024, what does the future hold? Nick, this is a very interesting chart from Mobile Squared. It paints a picture of the previous 3 years, showing that we're seeing quite a ramp in traffic. But moving forward, 2024 going onwards, it's actually showing quite a decline in AIT traffic. Can you give us a bit of depth on this chart and what are the factors driving this change?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key thing is really it's the brand response. So we've already seen that some of the major brands that are driving the international traffic have significantly reduced their traffic for the year in 2023, and that will obviously be carried throughout 2024 and beyond. So I think that's one of the major things as well, in terms of they're more aware of the situation, of kind of the threat. They're responding to it. They're using other channels. So the overall traffic as a whole is going to drop. So, for example, again, these are still early numbers from our side, but it looks as though year on year, from year end 22 to year end 23, the international traffic volumes dropped by about 14%. What we're expecting was an increase of about, I think it's about 5-10%, but which means that, you know, there's an even greater significant drop based on kind of our expectations for the year end, in terms of kind of what we believe the actual traffic probably will be. So there's a big drop there in traffic, but it's perhaps not as big as everyone thought it would be, and even we thought it would be significantly bigger, because a lot of the issues, a lot of the high international rates, a lot of where the AIT is happening is actually in, or we believe is happening in markets where, you know, there's actually quite small volumes. So we've got our risk assessment at Mobile Squared, and there's, I think, 3 or 4 high risk markets in the top 20 international markets. So, you know, in theory, a lot of where the damage is happening is in the kind of mid-sized to smaller markets themselves, which obviously kind of limits exactly how damaging overall this is. However, the impact on the rest of the market is having a global global effect, because of the fact that these major brands are trying to find a different way, different channel to kind of send their traffic. So part of that is the fact that the change in brand awareness, brand activity, brand behavior, and their awareness towards this. Also, I think the industry will act, and they are acting, which is obviously what we're doing here and beyond, in terms of trying to identify the traffic at source. Who are the kind of the rogue elements within the ecosystem, and what are we going to do about that? So I think that in itself is going to have quite a big impact this year, and it has to, because the fact is that, you know, the brand behavior is changing. So that is going to have a significant impact on everyone within this value chain. So we have to move fast. And so, you know, based on all of our research in terms of the analysis that we did, we do expect AIT to start to be tackled very quickly, but it will survive. It will go on. It will now be a feature among the kind of fraud element within SMS moving forward. But in actual fact, if you look at the overall fraud levels of SMS, it still makes it a much cleaner channel than pretty much any other channel that brands are using when communicating with their customers. I think overall fraud traffic accounts for, I think, less than 15% of total traffic. So again, we have to put this into perspective. It's damaging because it's really hitting the brands in their pockets, in their budgets, but ultimately they're used to that, I'm afraid to say, because of what goes on in other channels. In digital marketing, it's not uncommon to see fraud hitting 40% of budgets. So in actual fact, we're nowhere near that, and that's not to say that you know, we've still got time to fix this. We need to fix this now, so that, you know, the brands put their faith back in this channel.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. I mean, yeah, we've heard about things like, you know, sort of the ad click farms that exist out there driving fraud in those other channels. And sometimes it's very easy to just sort of look at our own parochial channel of messaging and look at the relative issues compared to previous years, rather than putting it in context of those other channels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and in fact, I see that there's a question that's come in saying, could the messages be moving to other cheaper platforms? I mean, I think you answer that question in that, yeah, messages can move to other channels, but in fact, those other channels themselves also are susceptible to frauds, whether it be AIT or other associated frauds there. So it's not like there's any perfect channel and any solution out there for enterprises.
There are, but I think the verification process kind of helps address that, and also because you've got the metrics in place, and, you know, sending something like WhatsApp, and I guess further down the line something like RCS. But with WhatsApp, you can see in theory how many messages you've sent, how many have been delivered. It's as simple as that. And you can then see kind of what the user engagement with has been with those messages. So I think the steps are already there, but that's not to say that the channel won't be abused, because it is effectively already being abused, because you have SMS offload using WhatsApp and RCS to avoid some of the high international rates. So the fraud's already there, like you say.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And I see, in fact, there's another comment saying, or question on the channel saying, we experience AIT as killing legitimate A2P SMS volume, which is impacting SMS business. And I think, yes, you certainly touched upon that. There is a consequential impact to the legitimate traffic. So, do you feel the industry has turned a corner on AIT? And what's your forecast for AIT in 2024 and beyond?
It's a good question. It feels like, I don't think it has sort of turned a corner. It has been pushed to take a different path in a way, less than sort of decided on its own. And I think in a way, if we're looking forward from 2024 onwards, it feels, and again, Nick has the numbers and projections, I only just have my gut feeling, but it feels as if it will drop, but it also feels that it will start becoming kind of the new blending in a way, like the next measure utilized in order to eke out the margin in an an everlasting game of how can you squeeze another bit of money or another bit of percentage out of that margin that you're doing on the messages, right? So it'll be gray routing, and then you'll trash a bit, and then there's AIT on top, and then everybody sells at the same amount rate or below the rates that the operators sell out. It's kind of already happening that way already, but it just feels like it might become a staple tool of the actual sort of portfolio that businesses use. It's just a question of, will it become so bad that SMS will start eking closer to email levels and digital marketing levels of fraud, where it becomes, on par. But if it then also becomes a lot more expensive, and while being just as fraudulent as all of the other channels, the question of viability comes into play. And we're already seeing, as Nick mentioned, using SMS and RCS to sort of, already optimize traffic from one end to another. And then we're also seeing scam going into RCS using B2P channels to do so. All of this variety coming into play. And it's just a question of, will it become so muddled and so much of a mess that business will just go, especially for OTPs, why not? We'll just go down the route of passkey. Fine, we'll bite the bullet, we'll take that, we'll invest the money into start utilizing that and doing the customer education, because maybe that down the line is cheaper. I don't know, but it definitely feels like it's not going away, it's decreasing, but it's starting to potentially seem like a staple of this business onward from some point on.
Oh, thanks. And Yuka, as a CPaaS, you deal with multiple channels. You've mentioned there a range of other ones. We've got a question in saying WhatsApp for businesses is picking up across the world. What type of controls have WhatsApp implemented to avoid potential attacks of AIT and also things like Viber? Are you seeing anything from that side, or even yourself there, Nick, that WhatsApp are doing on AIT control, or is it actually not an issue from the cost side? A question to either of you there. Any thoughts or opinions on
Sure, I'll start. I don't see it right now on WhatsApp or Viber or other channels. We haven't seen it. Maybe a big part of it is because a lot of businesses connect to WhatsApp directly, so you could just use it directly. So WhatsApp would be essentially the one generating traffic for themselves, and at least so far it seems like it's not being done. And there's also not as big of a value chain in terms of somebody gaining from that, because if you're generating traffic for your WhatsApp channel and you're not at the receiving end of it at one point in time, and you don't control the chain, so you can't trash the messages to make the maximum amount of revenue from that, it's going to start having less of an economic impact on your bottom line. So you're probably not going to be playing around with it as much. Also, there's, I would say, still not as much traffic on WhatsApp to bother with trying to playing around with all of the features and everything else. It's still more useful or easier to just try to shift some SMS traffic towards WhatsApp, do some overriding on a platform or whatever for the OTP traffic. It's probably simpler, easier, doesn't sort of it doesn't seem to be as bad, and it isn't boosting the traffic, it's using the legitimate traffic. So it seems that right now it's not an issue. I'm not saying it won't be an issue, but at least right now I don't see it. I see other use cases for it.
Oh, thanks. Nick, anything? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think certainly with WhatsApp, it doesn't have the scale yet, despite what everyone thinks. So, for example, I mean, in terms of traffic, I'm just trying to open traffic now, so I've got the actual figure for you. But total traffic on WhatsApp is, I think it's less than about 10 billion a month. Which, if you compare that, you can't mask fraudulent activity, certainly anything in AIT, when you have that kind of traffic levels. If you think, with SMS, we're up to kind of 2.5, closing in, or we were closing in about 3 trillion a year. Within that, you can put in the AIT. You can try and kind of hide it, with the phantom traffic, but you can't do that because you don't have the scale. Despite what everyone thinks about WhatsApp, it's not that big yet. It's pretty small. So the migration over has taken significantly longer than everyone, we included, expected. But what's happening as well is that we're seeing, because of what's happening with AIT, the high termination rates, that is kind of forcing some of these kind of major brands to use WhatsApp for some of their services as well. So that in itself is helping to drive the migration of this traffic. So yeah, it's happening, but WhatsApp isn't quite the threat yet. But also, it doesn't have the appeal to the rogue element, because obviously the cost of a WhatsApp is kind of where very comparable to where the domestic SMS is. It may be a bit higher in some markets, it's a bit lower, but it's not the 20 cents, 25 cents that makes a particular market really compelling from a fraudster perspective. So no, I think WhatsApp should remain pretty clean on the WhatsApp business, certainly on the API side, should remain very clean for the foreseeable future, providing that it doesn't muck around with its pricing too much.
Yeah. As we've seen, pricing of it is a very key factor in all of this. So we've presented a lot of information to you all. I hope you found this informative and educational. We'll be publishing a white paper on the AIT impact to market, containing all the data that you've seen in this, and actually a range of additional insights and information, along with that taxonomy of AIT attack types. If you're interested in a copy, please get in touch and visit our website at www.enea.com. We'll also be at MWC Barcelona, so it'd be great to meet you in person. If anybody also wants to come meet to us and talk about this issue in more detail. So it just remains for me to thank my fellow panelists. Nick, Uku, thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for attending this Fierce Wireless webinar and submitting so many fantastic questions. Special thanks to our panel of speakers for participating, and Enea for presenting today's webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be available for you. You'll be able to access it within 24 hours using the same audience link that you used to join today. You'll also get an email letting you know that it's ready. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you soon at future events.